we've had multiple issues. It's not just hitting. It's kind of, we need to play better baseball, and that's pretty much as simple as that. We're 9-19 because we haven't played good enough baseball.
Talking about hiring a guy like Donnie with, that type of pedigree, because as great as our staff is, we don't have that guy that's been a star in the big leagues.
He's a disappointment. That's the blunt truth. Don Mattingly had to face when he took over a Phillies team that had fallen apart before the calendar even hit May. The players were talented. The money was spent. The expectations were sky high, but the Phillies stumbled badly, and it wasn't bad luck. It was important players failing in important moments. The Mattingly stepped into a mess he did not create, but he still had to clean it up. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icon. Rob Thomson had led this team to years of success. But the 2026 Phillies did not look like a contender. They looked lost. When the losses piled up, the front office made a change. The Don Mattingly, a Hall of Fame level player and an experienced manager, walked into a clubhouse full of good names attached to bad results. He did not point fingers in public. He did not throw players under the bus for the cameras. But behind closed doors, he knew exactly who had let this team down. And if you think this Phillies collapse deserves more attention, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, because this story has too many names behind it to ignore. This was not one player having a rough week. This was not one bad month that fixed itself. This was a group of players who were supposed to carry the Phillies through the toughest part of the season, and instead, they became the reason the team fell into an early hole. Some of these players were seasoned veterans who were supposed to know better. Some were bright young prospects who were rushed into the fire. Some had all the physical tools in the world, but could not put it together when it mattered most. Not every disappointment looks the same. The A veteran letting you down feels different from a rookie struggling to adjust. The A hitter in a slump is a different problem than a pitcher who cannot find the strike zone in a big moment. But all 7 of these players share one thing. The Phillies needed more from them, and they did not get it. The Mattingly saw it happen in real time. He backed his players in public, the way a good manager should, but support from a manager does not erase results on the field. It does not fix a losing streak. It does not turn an empty bat into a hit, and it does not turn a walk into a strikeout. Some players on this list were expected to be leaders. Some were expected to be quiet contributors who simply did their job every night. Some were young players still trying to earn their place. But when a team starts as badly as the Phillies did, every single role matters. There is no room for a weak link, and there is no room for excuses. The A veteran cannot hide behind experience if the results are not there. The A prospect cannot hide behind potential if the production never shows up. The Mattingly understood this from the very beginning of his time in charge, and it shaped the way he handled every single player on this roster. Think about how quickly a season can slip away when several problems stack up at the same time. 1 struggling player is a footnote. 2 struggling players is a concern. 7 struggling players, all at once, is exactly how a talented roster ends up buried in the standings before the calendar even turns to summer. That is the exact situation Mattingly walked into, and it is why every single name on this list matters so much to the bigger story of this Phillies season. This is the story of 7 Phillies players who let the team down when the Phillies needed them the most. We are counting down from number 7 to number 1, and by the end you will understand exactly why Don Mattingly had such a difficult job on his hands. Number 7. Jesus Luzardo. Luzardo came to Philadelphia with real promise. He had shown flashes of brilliance before, the kind of stuff that makes scouts excited and fans dream about a true frontline starter. And to be fair, Luzardo did have some outstanding outings. There were nights when his fastball had life and his secondary pitches were sharp, and it looked like the Phillies had found exactly the arm they needed, but those nights were not consistent enough. Injuries got in the way. Kid's control came and went without warning. One start, he looked like an ace, and the next start, he looked like a pitcher who could not find any rhythm at all. The Phillies did not need flashes. They needed a frontline starter. They could count on every 5th day. That is what a true number 2 or number 3 starter is supposed to give a team. Instead, Luzardo's availability became a constant question mark. Could he stay healthy long enough to matter? Could he string together 3 or 4 strong starts in a row without a setback? Those questions hung over the rotation all season, and they were never fully answered. Think about what that means for a pitching staff. When a starter cannot be trusted to give you innings, everything shifts. The bullpen gets used earlier. Relievers get worn down faster. The other starters feel pressure to pitch deeper into games just to cover the gap. Luzardo's inconsistency did not just hurt his own numbers. It rippled through the entire pitching staff, forcing Mattingly to manage around a hole that should not have existed. There is a difference between a pitcher who is simply bad and a pitcher who shows you greatness and then takes it away. Luzardo was the second kind, and in some ways, that made it worse. The Phillies could see exactly what he was capable of. They watched him dominate lineups on his good nights. That made the bad nights sting even more, because everyone in that clubhouse knew the talent was real. It was the follow-through that was missing. By the time the season reached its toughest stretch, Luzardo had become a symbol of unfulfilled promise. Not a bust. Not a failure in every sense, but a painful reminder that flashes of excellence are not the same as being a frontline starter a team can lean on. When the Phillies needed a rock in the rotation, Luzardo gave them a question mark instead, and that question mark cost this team early in the year. Wanted so badly to believe in him. Every time he took the mound, there was a real sense of hope in the building because everyone remembered what he looked like on his best night. That hope is exactly what made the inconsistency so hard to accept. The A pitcher without talent does not create hope in the first place. Luzardo created it constantly, then took it away just as often, and a rotation cannot be built around hope alone. It has to be built around results, start after start, and that is the one thing Luzardo could not consistently provide when his team needed him most. The A manager cannot plan around a pitcher he is not sure will be available every 5 days. Mattingly had to think about contingency plans, about how the bullpen might need to cover extra innings, about whether the schedule could be shuffled if Luzardo needed extra rest. That kind of planning takes energy away from the rest of the roster, forces coaches and front office staff to spend time solving a problem that should not exist with a pitcher of his talent. When a team is already fighting through a rough start, it cannot afford to spend extra energy managing around uncertainty in the rotation. And that is exactly the burden Luzardo placed on this Phillies team. Consistency is often the hardest thing for a talented pitcher to find, because it has nothing to do with raw ability and everything to do with repeating the same mechanics and the same mindset outing after outing. Luzardo clearly had the ceiling of a frontline starter. What he lacked was the floor, the guarantee that even on an off night he could still give his team 5 or 6 solid innings. That gap between ceiling and floor is exactly why he sits at number 7 on this list. A reminder that potential without reliability still leaves a team searching for answers. The number 6, Orion Kerkering. Kerkering is exactly the kind of young arm that gets fans excited. The electric stuff, the A fastball with serious life. The secondary pitches that can make hitters look silly when everything lines up. On paper, this is the profile of a shutdown reliever, the type of arm a team builds its bullpen around for years. But stuff alone does not win baseball games. The command does, and that was Kerkering's biggest problem in the moments that mattered most. In lower leverage innings, Kerkering could look outstanding, but drop him into a high-pressure spot, a tie game, a one-run lead, a moment where one bad pitch changes everything, and the command would sometimes disappear. The A young reliever cannot survive off pure stuff when the strike zone becomes a mystery. Hitters at this level do not need many mistakes. They need one, and Kerkering gave them enough of those mistakes in big spots to become a real concern for Mattingly. To his credit, Mattingly did not give up on him. He defended Kerkering publicly and encouraged him to trust his pitches instead of nibbling around the edges of the plate. That is the right approach for a young arm with this much talent. But encouragement does not throw strikes. Only the pitcher can do that. Through the toughest part of the season, Kerkering's control problems in big moments made him someone the Phillies could not always trust when the game was on the line. This is what makes Kerkering's disappointment feel different from some of the others on this list. His talent was never in question. Nobody was arguing about whether he belonged in the major leagues. The issue was execution under pressure, the exact moment when a reliever is supposed to prove his value. Instead of being a weapon Mattingly could call on with total confidence, Kerkering became a decision that carried real risk every time his name was called in a tight game. Bullpens live and die by moments like these. One blown save can undo weeks of good work from the rest of the roster. One walk in the wrong spot can turn a win into a loss. Kerkering's command issues, even if they were occasional, showed up at times when the Phillies could least afford them. The arm was ready. The results did not always follow, and that gap between talent and execution became one more reason this team dug itself into an early hole. There is a certain kind of pressure that only shows up in the 9th inning or in a tie game with the bases loaded, and not every arm handles that pressure the same way. Some relievers get sharper. Some relievers tighten up and lose the feel for their pitches they had just moments earlier. 4 stretches of the season, Kerkering fell into the second group, and Mattingly had to make tough decisions about when he could trust him and when he could not. That is not an easy problem to solve, and it is not one that fixes itself overnight. It requires reps, experience, and a young pitcher learning to slow the game down in his own mind, something that takes time the Phillies did not always have during their toughest stretch. Young relievers are often judged unfairly, but in a season like this one, fairness is not really the point. The Phillies were fighting for every single win, and every shaky outing from the bullpen mattered more than it would in a normal year. Kerkering's talent gave the coaching staff every reason to keep trusting him, but trust has to be earned pitch by pitch in this kind of role. Until his command matched his stuff on a consistent basis, Kerkering remained a talented arm the Phillies could not fully rely on in the moments that decided games. The number 5, Brandon Marsh was never expected to be the centerpiece of this lineup. Nobody was asking him to be the star. But every good offense needs contributions from the bottom half of the order, and that is exactly where Marsh let the Phillies down. When your best hitters are not enough on their own, the rest of the lineup has to pick up the slack. Marsh did not do that often enough, and his inconsistency at the plate became a real problem during stretches when the Phillies desperately needed length in the lineup. Baseball is full of moments that do not show up on a highlight reel, but decide games anyway. The A runner on second base with 2 outs, the A-man on third, with less than 2 outs and a chance to add a cheap run. These are situational hitting moments, and they are exactly where Marsh struggled the most. The Mattingly repeatedly stressed the need for better situational hitting from his roster, and Marsh was one of the clearest examples of a player who could not consistently deliver in those spots. It is easy to overlook a player who is not supposed to carry a team, but that is precisely why Marsh's failures mattered so much. When the top of the order goes quiet, or when a starting pitcher is dealing and the Phillies need every single opportunity they can find, the bottom of the lineup has to step up and manufacture something. The A productive out, the A 2-strike single, the A sacrifice fly when it counts. Marsh's inconsistency meant those extra runs were not there when the Phillies needed them. This is not about one bad week or one cold streak. This is about a pattern. Good teams need contributions from everyone on the roster, not just the players making headlines. When Marsh went quiet for stretches at a time, it made every other hitter's job harder because there was no cushion left in the lineup. One missed opportunity is forgettable. The A pattern of missed opportunities becomes a real problem, and that is exactly what happened during the Phillies' early struggles. The Mattingly could not fix this with a pep talk. Situational hitting is a skill that has to show up in real time, pitch by pitch, at bat by at bat. Marsh's struggles in those key moments left runs on the table that the Phillies could not afford to leave behind, and that lack of production from the bottom of the order became one more piece of a much bigger problem. Think about how many close games a season like this ends up producing. The one run here, one run there decides far more games than fans usually realize. A single extra run manufactured by the bottom of the order can flip a loss into a win over the course of a long season. Marsh had the physical tools to be that extra run more often than he was. The frustration from Mattingly and the coaching staff never came from a lack of belief in his ability. It came from watching those situational chances slip away again and again at exactly the moments when the Phillies could not afford to let them slip. The A lineup is only as strong as its weakest link during the moments that decide games, and for long stretches, that weak link showed up right where Marsh was hitting. It is a hard truth for any player to hear, but it is also a fixable one. The situational hitting can improve with focus and repetition, and nobody on this list is being written off completely. Still, during the exact stretch when the Phillies needed every single run they could find, Marsh's bat did not provide the boost this lineup was counting on. Number 4, Justin Crawford. Every organization dreams of a prospect like Justin Crawford. The elite tools, a name that gets scouts talking, and expectations that build for years before a player ever steps into a major league batter's box. When Crawford finally got his chance, the hype around his debut was enormous. Wanted to see the future arrive right away. Instead, what they saw was the very real gap between potential and readiness, and that gap became one of the Phillies' most talked about disappointments. This is not really Crawford's fault in the way some of the others on this list are responsible for their own struggles. He is young. He is still learning how to play at the highest level in the world. But regardless of age or potential, the Phillies still needed production, and hype alone does not win baseball games. The A team in the middle of a rough stretch cannot simply wait patiently for a prospect to figure things out. The every game matters. Every at-bat matters, and Crawford's early struggles added one more difficult chapter to an already difficult season. The Mattingly showed patience with him, which is exactly the right approach for a player this young. He acknowledged the learning curve publicly and did not pile pressure onto a rookie who was already adjusting to the toughest level of competition in the sport. That patience is a manager doing his job correctly. But patience from a manager does not turn a strikeout into a hit, and it does not erase the missed opportunities that came with Crawford's rocky start. There is a hard lesson in this story for anyone who follows prospects closely. Potential is not the same as production. The A player can have every tool scouts dream about and still struggle mightily once real major league pitching is thrown his way. Crawford's promotion exposed exactly that gap, and while nobody expected him to be perfect right away, the Phillies still felt the impact of his early struggles during a season where they could not afford another weak link. This is why Crawford belongs on this list. Even with all the sympathy that comes with being young, the Phillies needed answers immediately, not answers a year or two down the road. The hype built up expectations that results simply did not match, at least not yet, and that gap between promise and performance became one more disappointment during an already difficult stretch for this team. None of this means Crawford cannot become exactly the player the organization hoped for. Plenty of talented players struggle mightily in their first taste of the major leagues before eventually figuring it out. But right now, in the middle of a season where the Phillies were desperately searching for answers, patience is a luxury that is hard to afford. The every game the team played without production from that spot in the lineup was one more game where the gap between hype and readiness became a little more obvious. And one more reason this early stretch felt so difficult to overcome. There is also a lesson here about how much pressure a young player carries when an entire fan base has been waiting years to see him arrive. Crawford did not ask for that pressure, but it followed him into every single at-bat once he reached the major leagues. Every strikeout looked bigger than it should have. Every quiet week looked worse than it really was, simply because the expectations were set so high before he ever got the chance to prove himself. That pressure is real, and it played a part in why his early struggles felt like such a significant disappointment for this Phillies team. The number 3, Johan Rojas. The Rojas is one of the most talented defensive outfielders in the entire league. Nobody questions that his range, his instincts, and his ability to track down balls that other outfielders simply cannot reach make him a genuine weapon in the field. That part of his game never let anyone down. But the Phillies needed more than a glove. They needed a complete player, and Rojas's inconsistent offense kept him from becoming exactly that. Great defense can absolutely save runs. It can turn extra base hits into simple outs, and it can change the entire complexion of a game before a pitch is even thrown. But defense alone cannot cover every empty at-bat, and that is the exact issue Rojas faced throughout the season. The Mattingly challenged him directly to become a more complete everyday player, someone who could contribute with the bat as consistently as he does in the outfield. That challenge was fair, and it reflected a real problem the team could not ignore. Think about what it means for a lineup when one spot is essentially only contributing on defense. Every other hitter has to work a little harder to make up for it. Every rally has one more obstacle to clear. The Rojas' glove kept the Phillies in games defensively, but his bat too often failed to add anything on the other side of the ball. Then that imbalance became a real weakness in the lineup during stretches when the Phillies desperately needed offense from every single spot in the order. This is a frustrating kind of disappointment because it is not about a total lack of value. The Rojas brought real value to this team every single game with his glove. But baseball requires balance. The A player who gives you elite defense and very little offense is only giving you half of what a true everyday player needs to provide. The Mattingly needed a complete contributor in that spot, and for long stretches of the season, that is simply not what he got. The Phillies could live with an occasional quiet week at the plate if the rest of the lineup was clicking, but during the team's roughest patches, they needed every hitter pulling weight, and Rojas's bat was not there often enough. The elite defense kept him in the lineup. The inconsistent offense kept him from being the complete difference maker this team needed him to be. There is something almost cruel about this kind of disappointment. The Rojas was not lazy. He was not careless. He worked hard on defense every single night, and it showed in highlight after highlight. But baseball does not give credit for effort alone, and a lineup spot that only produces on one side of the ball leaves a team constantly searching for offense somewhere else. The Mattingly's challenge to Rojas was not an insult. It was a simple truth that every complete player eventually has to hear, and until Rojas answered that challenge with his bat as consistently as he does with his glove, this remained one of the clearest gaps on the entire roster. Compare this to a hitter who struggles defensively but rakes at the plate. Teams find ways to hide a defensive weakness, because the offense more than makes up for it. The Rojas presented the opposite challenge, and that is a much harder puzzle for a manager to solve. You cannot bench elite defense without losing outs in the field, but you also cannot ignore a lineup spot that is not producing runs. The Mattingly was stuck trying to balance both sides of that equation, and Rojas's inconsistent bat meant that balance rarely tipped fully in the Phillies' favor. Number 2. The Alec Bohm. Bohm entered the season carrying real expectations. He was supposed to be one of the more reliable bats in this lineup, someone Mattingly could count on to drive in runs and set the tone for the rest of the order. Instead, Bohm fell into a long offensive slump right at the start of the year, exactly when the Phillies could least afford it. His lack of production quickly became one of the biggest talking points surrounding this team's early struggles. The A lineup depends on its middle-of-the-order hitters staying hot, or at least staying consistent. When one of those hitters goes cold for weeks at a time, the entire offense feels it. The other hitters get pitched around less carefully. The scoring chances disappear. The rallies stall before they ever really start. That is exactly what happened during Bohm's slump. His bat was supposed to be one of the more dependable pieces in this lineup, and for a long stretch, it was anything but dependable. This is the kind of disappointment that hurts because it is so visible. Every fan watching the Phillies during this stretch could see it happening in real time. Easy fly ball instead of a hard line drive. The strikeout in a spot where the team desperately needed a base hit. Game after game, the frustration built, and Bohm's bat going quiet became one of the clearest symbols of the Phillies' early season problems. Before the team's turnaround finally arrived under Mattingly, Bohm was very much part of the problem, not the solution. That does not erase the talent he clearly has, and it does not mean he cannot still turn things around. But during the exact stretch when the Phillies were digging themselves into a hole, Bohm was one of the players who could not disappear from the lineup's list of concerns. The team needed offense, and for too long, that offense simply was not there. The lineup cannot function properly when one of its most trusted bats goes silent. The Bohm's slump left runs on the board that never came home, and it added one more layer of frustration to a Phillies team already searching for answers. He had the ability to be a difference maker in that lineup. Instead, for a critical stretch of the season, he became one more name on the list of disappointments. The slumps happened to every hitter in the game, even the best ones in history. That is not the issue here. The issue is timing. The cold stretch in the middle of a strong season barely gets noticed. The cold stretch at the exact moment a team is trying to avoid falling too far behind becomes a much bigger story. Bohm's slump landed right in the middle of the Phillies' worst stretch of the year, and that timing turned an ordinary rough patch into one of the most talked about issues on the entire roster. Fans and analysts alike began asking the same question during this stretch. Was this simply a bad run of luck, or was something deeper going on with his approach at the plate? The Mattingly and the coaching staff had to work through that question in real time, all while the losses kept piling up around them. There is no easy fix for a slump like this. It takes patience, repetition, and sometimes a willingness to change small details in an approach that has worked for years. Bohm's early season struggles forced exactly that kind of soul-searching at the worst possible time for a team already fighting uphill. The number one, Aaron Nola. Every player on this list, Aaron Nola's struggles hurt the most because he was supposed to be the safest piece on this entire roster. The Nola was brought in to anchor the rotation, the steady presence a pitching staff builds itself around. When a team has a true anchor, every other starter benefits from that stability. Instead of stability, the Phillies got inconsistency at the exact position they could least afford it. This was not a rookie adjusting to the big leagues or a reliever learning to handle high-pressure innings. This was a proven starter who was supposed to stop losing streaks in their tracks and set the tone for the entire staff. Instead, Nola struggled badly during the Phillies' disastrous start to the season, and his inconsistency became one of the single biggest reasons this team fell into an early hole they had to fight their way out of. The Mattingly continued to back him publicly, the way a good manager supports his veterans through a rough stretch. That kind of support matters in a clubhouse. It shows the rest of the roster that struggles are handled with patience rather than panic. But public support from a manager does not erase runs allowed. It does not undo a rough outing, and it certainly does not fix a rotation anchor who is supposed to be the one pitcher a team can always count on. There is a reason this hurts more than the others on this list. The prospect struggling is almost expected. The young reliever fighting for command is part of the learning process. But a veteran anchor, someone with Nola's track record and reputation, is supposed to be immune to this kind of extended slump. That is the entire point of having an anchor in the first place. When that anchor becomes unreliable, everything above him in the rotation feels the pressure, and everything below him has to try to cover the gap. The Phillies needed Nola to be the pitcher who stopped the bleeding after a tough loss, the arm that steadied the ship during a difficult week. Instead, his own inconsistency became part of the problem the team was trying to escape. That is exactly why he sits at number 1 on this list. Not because his talent disappeared, but because the gap between what the Phillies needed from him and what he actually gave them was the widest of any player on this roster. Every rotation needs one pitcher the whole staff can look to on the toughest days, someone whose turn in the rotation feels like a small sense of relief after a difficult stretch. That is supposed to be exactly what an anchor provides. Instead, Nola's own turns in the rotation started to feel uncertain, and uncertainty is the last thing a struggling team needs from its most established arm. When the pitcher who is supposed to calm things down becomes part of the storm, the entire staff feels the weight of it, and that is precisely what happened to the Phillies during this stretch of the season. Teammates notice these things too, even if they rarely say it out loud. When the established veteran struggles, it changes the mood in the clubhouse. Younger pitchers wonder if the same thing could happen to them. The bullpen braces itself a little more on days when Nola takes the mound, just in case things go sideways early. That kind of ripple effect is hard to measure in the box score, but it is very real. And it is exactly why an inconsistent anchor does more damage to a rotation than an inconsistent middle or back-end starter ever could. This is why Nola closes out this list at number 1. Every other player here had some kind of built-in excuse: youth, inexperience, a specific mechanical issue, or a role that only asks for occasional contributions. The Nola had none of those excuses. He had the track record, the experience, and the responsibility that comes with being the pitcher a rotation is built around. When that responsibility went unmet during the toughest stretch of the season, it hurt this Phillies team more than any other single disappointment on this entire roster. So there it is. 7 players who let the Phillies down during one of the most difficult stretches this franchise has faced in years. The A rotation anchor who could not find consistency. The A trusted bat who went cold at the worst possible time. The A defensive standout who could not add enough offense. The A hyped prospect who was not ready for the moment. The A situational hitter who could not deliver when it counted. The A young arm with electric stuff but shaky command. And a starter with real flashes of brilliance who could not stay available or consistent enough to be trusted. The Mattingly did not create this mess. He inherited it, and he handled it the only way a good manager can, with patience in public and accountability behind closed doors. He backed his players when they needed support, and he challenged them when they needed a push. But no manager can hit the ball for his players, and no manager can throw a strike from the dugout. The results had to come from the roster itself, and for a painful stretch of this season, those results simply were not there. What makes this story so frustrating for Phillies fans is that it was never about one single weakness. It was not just the rotation. It was not just the lineup. It was not just the bullpen. It was a rotation anchor struggling at the same time. A key hitter was slumping while a defense-first player could not find his bat, while a prospect was still learning the league. While a streaky hitter kept failing in key spots, while a young reliever fought his own command, and while a talented starter battled inconsistency and health at the same time. Any one of these problems on its own might have been manageable. The all 7 happening together is exactly how a talented roster ends up buried early in the season. There is still reason for hope here. The Phillies did show real signs of a turnaround once Mattingly settled into the job, and several of these players still have the talent to rewrite their own stories before the season is finished. Nobody is writing these players off completely. Talent does not disappear overnight, and careers are rarely defined by one difficult stretch alone. But the truth from this season cannot be ignored either. The Phillies were not dragged down by one single player having a bad year. They were dragged down by 7 players failing to meet the moment at the exact same time. And that is a much harder problem for any manager to solve. The A manager can only do so much from the dugout. He can set the lineup. He can manage the bullpen. He can have honest conversations behind closed doors and push players to be better. But he cannot swing the bat for them, and he cannot throw the pitches himself. The Mattingly did everything within his control, and he did it with the kind of steady leadership that comes from decades in this game. The rest was always going to come down to the players themselves. And for a difficult stretch of this season, too many of them were not ready to answer that call. The baseball has a way of rewarding patience and punishing shortcuts, and this Philly season is a clear example of both. The players who worked through their struggles quietly, without excuses, gave themselves the best chance to turn things around. The ones who leaned on hype, reputation, or potential without matching it with results found themselves exactly where this list finds them, as symbols of a disappointing start rather than the driving force behind a winning team. That is the lesson every player on this roster now carries into the rest of the season. This is also a lesson for fans watching from the outside. It is easy to blame a manager when a team struggles, and it is easy to blame the front office for the roster they built. But sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Sometimes talented players just do not perform at the exact moment their team needs them most, and no amount of strategy or leadership can force results that simply are not there. The Mattingly's early stretch in charge was a real test of patience, both for him and for every player trying to find their footing under a new voice in the clubhouse. Every one of these 7 players still has time to change how this season is remembered. The A hot streak from Bohm, a string of dominant starts from Luzardo, or a defensive gem paired with timely hits from Rojas could shift the entire narrative before the year is over. That is the nature of a long baseball season. It gives players chances to redeem themselves that shorter sports simply do not allow. But for now, looking back at the start of this year, these 7 names stand out as the clearest reasons the Phillies fell into an early hole they had to fight their way out of. The Don Mattingly walked into this job with a team full of talent and a scoreboard full of problems. He did what a good manager is supposed to do. He backed his players, he challenged them, and he protected them from unnecessary outside noise. But talent without results is not enough at this level, and this season proved exactly why the game is played on the field and not on paper. 7 players did not give enough when the Phillies needed it most, and that is the real story behind this team's difficult start. Every fan base has felt this exact frustration at some point. You look at a roster on paper and it makes sense. The names are good. The talent is obvious. And yet the record on the field tells a completely different story. That gap between paper and performance is where managers earn their reputation, and it is where players either rise to the occasion or add their name to a list like this one. For the Phillies, 7 players ended up on the wrong side of that gap during the most difficult stretch of their season, and the fallout from that stretch shaped the entire direction of their year.